One of the things I'm known for is every morning I take a page from the New York Times and I start making boxes around words that pop out at me. And I start connecting the words into these little phrases or funny sayings. And then when I get something that looks good, I black out everything I don't need. And this is what it kind of looks like when they're done. It sort of looks like if the CIA did a haiku. And as you can tell, this one's about Texas. In Texas, there is nothing but Texas. This one's called Overheard on the Titanic. I mean, yes, we're sinking, but the music is exceptional. This one's called What is Marriage? Marriage is two people in love standing in the same bathroom. Now, when I first started making these, I figured newspapers wouldn't even be around after a while, so I figured I could just stop and do something else. But 9 years later, I'm kind of stuck with this body of work now, and I've actually become kind of a newspaper nerd. Like, I'm kind of a newspaper junkie. And it's always been this really silly dream of mine to appear in one of the articles that I was going to black out. And 2 weeks ago, my silly dream came true. I was interviewed by a reporter from the New York Times. I was quoted in the New York Times. I was even fact-checked by the New York Times, which honestly was the most thrilling part of the experience, getting the call from the fact-checker. Now, what did the New York Times interview me about? Did they ask me about my art? No, they did not ask me about my art. Did they review one of the 3 books I've published? No, they did not. I finally got in the New York Times, and what was the article about? The article was essentially asking whether the conference at which I get to give the keynote address, whether it had jumped the shark. Is it over? Has it gotten too big? Now, I know it's a question that everyone's asking, and probably, some of you have asked it. And truth be told, some of my best friends that I've made at South by Southwest didn't even bother to show up this year. And the question's been asked for years now. Has South by Southwest gotten too big? Is it over? And it's actually a question that the city of Austin's asking itself. Has it gotten too big? Is it over? And it's a question that the internet asks itself. Is it gotten too big? Is it over? Is there any room for the rest of us? Now, I don't personally think anything's over, but I do feel like, and stay with me on this, okay? I feel like we're sort of in a monster movie. Now, don't worry, you're safe right now. You're safe right now. We're in the farmhouse with the boarded up windows. But outside those walls, there are swarms of the infected. And the infected are split into 2 camps. I call them vampires and human spam. Now, how do you identify these infected? I will start with the vampires. And I'm going to illustrate with the story I read about Picasso. Pablo Picasso was notorious for sucking all the energy out of the people he met. His own granddaughter, Marina Picasso, suggested that he squeezed people out like one of his tubes of oil paints. It's quite the metaphor coming from your own granddaughter. Now, here's what hanging out with Picasso was like. You would spend the afternoon with Picasso, having a good time, and then at the end of the day, you would end up a nervous, exhausted wreck. You'd head home and you'd basically collapse in your bed. But not Picasso. Picasso would go back to his studio and paint all night using the energy that he'd sucked out of you. Now, most people put up with this because, hey, he was Picasso. And when a so-called genius wants to hang out with you, you should probably hang out with him. But one guy who wasn't having any of it was Constantine Brancusi. Now, we're in Texas now. It doesn't matter if I mispronounced his name. This is the land of mispronunciations. Anyway, Brancusi hailed from the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, home of Vlad the Impaler and Dracula. Brancusi knew a vampire when he saw one. And Brancusi was not about to have his creative juices and his work sucked away from him. Brancusi practiced what I call the vampire test. It's kind of a simple way to determine who you should let in and out of your life. If, after hanging out with someone, you feel full of energy, that person is not a vampire. If, after hanging out with someone, you feel worn out and depleted, that person is a vampire. There's another monster in this movie who is a cousin of the vampire, and that's a creature I call human spam. Now, what is human spam? I will illustrate with another rousing story. When I was in college, I took a lot of creative writing workshops. And inevitably, in every workshop, you would run into the classmate who said, well, I really like to write, but I don't like to read. And it was evident right away that you could write this person off completely. Because any writer knows that if you want to be a great writer, you have to be a great reader first. If you want to be a master, you have to first be an apprentice. If you want to have fans, you have to start off as a fan yourself. Now, the human spam amongst us, they have somehow missed this memo, and they exist in every profession, in every corner of the world. A piece of human spam, they want you to listen to their story, but they don't stick around to listen to yours. A piece of human spam wants you to fund his Kickstarter project when he's never funded a Kickstarter project in his life. A piece of human spam wants you to come to his South by Southwest panel, but he won't be coming to yours. Vampires and human spam, they exist on the same spectrum. The vampire wants to drain us, and the human spam wants to drown us. Now, vampires and human spam, I don't think they're necessarily malicious creatures. In fact, I think some of them started off as fairly lovely human beings. The trouble is I think they've been given the wrong operator's manual. They've been infected by the idea that the only way to get ahead in this life is to promote yourself endlessly and chill your products and destroy the competition and squirrel away glory for yourself. Where do these creatures come from? I personally think that these creatures stem from our faulty notion of creativity and work. Now, somehow in this culture, we have bought into the lone genius myth. And under the lone genius myth, creativity is the domain of the individual, the superhumanly gifted genius, the person born with originality in his DNA and talent flowing in his veins. This person is not like you or me. This person is special. And for the genius to be most effective, he must squirrel himself away in the confines of a studio and wait for inspiration to gather like storm clouds. And when the lightning of inspiration strikes, the genius harnesses it into his work, creating perfect masterpieces that he then graces us with so we might all gawk and awe at his achievements. Now, under this model, creativity is mostly an antisocial act, and the way to be more creative is to emulate geniuses. Wall yourself off from humanity, torment yourself and suffer for your art, keep your process and your ideas secret until you are ready to unleash them on the world, or until the world is ready to accept you as the gift from the gods that you are. It's the old model of creativity. And I'd like to suggest that there's another way of thinking about creativity that comes to us by way of Brian Eno, and that is called scenius. Now, scenius is a communal form of genius. Under this model, good work, creativity, and great ideas are birthed in a kind of network of creative individuals, a whole scene of artists, curators, thinkers, theorists, tastemakers, and fans who make up a kind of ecology of talent. Now, if you look back at history, many of the people who we think of as lone geniuses were actually, to quote Brian Eno, part of a whole scene of people who were supporting each other, looking at each other's work, copying from each other, stealing ideas, and contributing ideas. So yes, there was Da Vinci, but there was also 15th century Florence. Picasso, sure, but also Paris in the early 20th century. The Talking Heads, but also New York in the late 1970s. Now, Scenius doesn't take away from the achievements of great individuals. It just acknowledges that good work isn't created in a vacuum, and that creativity is always, in some sense, a collaboration, the result of one mind connected to other minds. Now, what I personally love about Scenius is that it makes room in the story of creativity for the rest of us, the people who don't consider ourselves geniuses. Being a valuable part of a Scenius isn't necessarily about how smart or talented you are, but it's about what you have to contribute, the ideas you share, the quality of the connections you make, and the conversations you start. We all want to be noticed for our efforts, and we all want our work to be discovered. Balzac died over 150 years ago, and it was the same in his time. For artists, the great problem to solve is how to get oneself noticed. But there is a right way and a wrong way to go about it. There's a way that's good for us as individuals, and there's a way that's good for the Scenius as a whole. So I would suggest that you forget about being a genius. You don't have to be a genius. You just have to become part of the Scenius. If we forget about how we can be more like geniuses and we think more about how we can contribute and nurture a Scenius, we can adjust our expectations and the expectations of the worlds we want to accept us. We can stop asking what others can do for us and start asking what we can do for others.